I'm Tim Davis, DevOps advocate for env0, and I want to welcome you to a pretty cool series that we have. This is the first or summary episode here of the series. I am joined by our chief geek, or our CEO, Ohad Maislish here. Ohad, how are you doing today?
I love the chief geek. It's exactly what I am.
I always like to tell people that. I mean, I know you're like the head of the business, but I like making sure that people know that you're not just, the business guy, that you're still a geek. Like
CGO, Chief Geek Officer.
I like
that sounds
that.
great.
That's fantastic. We should use that from now on.
That's my new title, definitely.
Excellent. So, we're going to be talking about a lot of things. I have a lot of cool guests lined up for this series, but I wanted to kind of sit down. There's going to be some folks that are finding us for the first time and are taking a look at these. So I wanted to have a nice little primer of who we are, what we do, and some of the things that we're going to be talking about across this series. So for anybody that doesn't know, env0, we are an infrastructure as code automation platform. And really the best way to kind of understand what we do and why we do it would be from Ohad himself. So Ohad, why don't you give us the story of like, why env0? What made you want to start and create a platform like this? And, kind of how did we get here?
Okay, so it always starts with a story, right? It didn't happen by accident. So yeah, before env0, I had two other companies. So one startup that had nothing to do with cloud computing. But after that, I had a services company, and I did the thing that a CGO likes best, the chief geek likes best, and that was back to coding and doing DevOps, cloud infrastructure automation projects. That was a few years ago, and that's where I've noticed a mega revolution that the cloud is going through from manual operations to code. Back then, I think CloudFormation was even used more than Terraform for AWS customers, but Terraform was always the promising multi-cloud framework that has a lot of, not sure if to say advantages, but has a lot of capabilities that in some way are advantages, like it's being sure. Open source, and it's a huge community and ecosystem. Anyway, I've noticed that nobody's clicking buttons anymore, and instead engineers are writing and maintaining code, Terraform, CloudFormation, Pulumi, and others. And it really reminded me of the era between Git and GitHub, that Git existed, but GitHub didn't exist.
Yep.
I worked for a company, we actually used SVN before Git, and there was no SVN hub. So I built an internal SVN hub, and I saw that the same thing is happening here. So Terraform, for example, is a technical framework, but the business solution on top is missing. And a lot of companies doing in-house solutions in order to have role-based access, policies, self-service, and integrations on top of infrastructure as code frameworks. So yeah, I've noticed that from my services company, we saw those issues at our customers, and the customers of our customers had the same issues. So it just made me think, if everybody is facing the same problem and fixing it in-house, it must be interesting.
And I always like hearing the Git versus GitHub thing, because there are some folks out there that don't necessarily understand that Git is just the underlying technology and GitHub is the platform that utilizes that. A lot of folks think that just GitHub is Git and what have you, but really it is a different layer. It adds different functionality and different abilities, and that's exactly what we're doing to infrastructure as code. And while we are part of the tacos, the Terraform automation and collaboration software, niche, as it were, one thing that I do like to point out, which you already did, was that there is more than one framework out there. It's not just Terraform. It's not just CloudFormation. There's Pulumi, there's ARM, there's, all kinds of stuff. And that is something that I'm glad y'all chose from the beginning, was to stay framework agnostic. We know that customers are out there using different frameworks, if not multiple frameworks at the same time. So that's why we like to make sure that we didn't just draw a line in the sand and say we're only going to do Terraform, or we're only going to do, TerraGrunt or what have you. We kind of allow customers to have the same benefits that we offer, regardless of what framework they would like to choose. And that's the same for whatever cloud they would like to choose. We don't care if they're just AWS or if they're Azure, if they're Google, if they're VMware. They can kind of choose how they want to do things, and we help them solve those problems. So getting into this series itself, we've kind of worked our way up of, we have the frameworks, we have the platform, but really there are a lot of challenges, a lot of gotchas and things like that come up along the way. We happen to, specifically be in a spot where we help solve a lot of those issues, specifically that come along when scaling infrastructure as code across teams. But we've kind of boiled a lot of that down, and we've come up with this series so that we can talk about the top 5 infrastructure as code management challenges. And, we're sitting here, we're doing a summary. So, some of the things that we'll be going over in other videos here in this series is going to be things like access control and compliance, security, workflow task automation, and then things like extensibility and integrations. All of these, while they do have some overlapping points, they do have some overlapping features for our platform, they can be broken up into very specific things because they do have different, issues that they solve. So for instance, like access control and compliance, in your opinion, why is having access control and compliance features important to a platform such as ours when it comes to helping teams automate infrastructure as code?
Great question. So if we look at the situation nowadays, all of our customers and every person that uses the cloud basically use 2 things. One is obviously the cloud vendor, AWS, GCP, Azure, and others. And the other, in a totally different vendor, is the source control, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and others. But nowadays, those 2 things represent the same thing. Okay, so those are the cloud resources because it represents via its code. And so you have challenges that you didn't have before it was code. The basic example I can give is drift. Okay, if somebody is changing the cloud resources without changing the code, you have a very dangerous situation. Those problems didn't happen before infrastructure as code. And if you have a drift, if somebody still has access to your cloud account, and most of customers, most of companies still have some people that can still access, even if they use infrastructure as code, some quick and dirty kind of operations are still being done in the old school kind of way of direct access to the cloud vendor and clicking a button. You get a drift, and few seconds, few minutes, few hours later, maybe you're going to have the new code execution of another update, and that will revert. That might revert the change that somebody did. So that's a very, very dangerous situation. So how we can have this compliance and role-based access that you've mentioned on those 2 things together? So you need to have that in the context of code. And if we look at GitHub, Bitbucket, they don't have the concept of code execution permissions. Okay, they have the permissions, who can change the code, who can approve code changes, how I get notified of code changes, what kind of tests and checks should be run in order to change code. It's all about changing and updating and collaborating with the code as it progresses. But this code represents cloud resources. By the way, the same code might represent 2 different cloud resources or more, one in production, one in staging. So what about the access? Who can execute this code on staging and who can execute this code on production? Okay, so those concepts do not exist, and they should. And only a system like env0 that has visibility on both platforms, on your Git code and on your cloud resources, can give you the context on how to manage that in scale.
And that's perfectly said. And it actually sets us up nicely for the next section of, what about not just security of who can see the code and who can execute the code and stuff like that, but what about security from us? What if there's a security team that wants to make sure that IP is protected, that everybody has control of their stuff at all times. And this kind of brings us into like the self-hosted agents and runners category. So in your opinion, why is that such a critical piece that, you know, any platform should offer when it comes to a solution like ours?
Great. So eventually what customers have in their cloud accounts is their production environments. And that's super important. Any harm to their production environment can cause significant business implications. And now you need to be both efficient and secure. Okay, you want your developers to beat their competition and deploy fast, but you need to be careful. And once it goes to production related resources, you have to be super careful. And so in a platform like env0 that gets access to your production environment, we offer our self-hosted agents, which basically means 99%. So you still have the productivity and the flexibility of a SaaS platform. It's like 99% of the env0 platform running in cloud. You don't need to install it. You don't need to maintain. You don't need to update. You don't need to manage when there are peaks and scale and how you take care of that. So we take care of all of that. But we do have one small runner that is Kubernetes based and can be run on any Kubernetes cluster that stores, or it doesn't store, but it has access to the customer's sensitive information, including the cloud credentials. So the env0 platform itself, the env0 platform itself doesn't have access to the cloud accounts, to those secrets, also private SSH keys to your Git repos. Access to code is also super important because it's also affects production. So with the architecture of self-hosted agents, by the way, env0 is not the only vendor to take that approach. So it's like a hybrid solution of both SaaS and an agent, on-prem agent, that allows you to enjoy both worlds: the security thanks to the self-hosted agent, and the flexibility and productivity thanks to still using SaaS versus the full on-prem, which has a lot of maintenance implications. So that's
exactly right.
So that's the modern approach that env0 also took, among other vendors, with the hybrid mode of 99% in the cloud, one security related,
one very important
agent.
percent,
but only that 1%. Okay, so it's better for you to run that in your Kubernetes, in your networking, in your data center, in your cloud account. And whatever you can run and trust, fully trust externally, that has zero risk, use the cloud. Whatever there is risk, do the things in order to reduce the risk.
That makes perfect sense. And, you know, in the beginning of that, you mentioned developers, and that seems to be a big push a lot is, you know, developers. But some folks may question that because we're talking about infrastructure. But infrastructure as code itself, I mean, it's not just infrastructure. This isn't like when I was a sysadmin or I was a data center technician, you know, racking and stacking hardware. This is infrastructure as code. It really brings together those two groups. And one big thing with infrastructure as code is, you know, the workflow and how it should be done properly, and things like that. It is a big change for somebody like myself who is, you know, very infrastructure centric in their career. But really, when it comes to infrastructure as code, it is the best way of going about it is utilizing those development methodologies. And that brings us along to workflow and task automation. And this one, we'll be talking about things like continuous deployment. We'll be talking about plan on pull request, you know, how GitHub is important into this process and everything like that. So, you know, again, in your opinion, why did we choose to go that route? Why are we supporting these methodologies? Is there any real way to do it without those features? You know, I'm interested in how you think about that.
The way to do it without those features is to compromise on one of two things. Either you check every change thoroughly slowly, manually, in order to reduce errors. Okay, so that might still keep you safe, but will slow you down. Sure. And the other option is to do the exact opposite. You cannot slow down, and infrastructure engineers change the Terraform, the Pulumi, the Crossplane. By the way, we still didn't mention the word Crossplane here in this session today, and I think it's super important to also mention Crossplane as the new shining infrastructure as code framework that looks actually really, really cool and promising. So if you change your code, it's very easily you can create chaos, you can create a catastrophe, like provisioning a resource in an unsecure way, or a very expensive group of resources, or even very easily destroying cloud resources. It can be done super easily. Okay, right. 20 years ago, to destroy resources, meaning you need to unplug something from the electricity or something.
Yeah, the building like burns down, or the power goes out or something, and
correct,
something catastrophic happens.
The equivalent for that today is to do a git push. Okay, so
one enter key can burn the whole thing down.
A git push can burn your entire production down, and maybe your backups, so you won't be able to restore. And we have some great stories that we heard from our customers, and why eventually they go to a solution like env0. So when things grow and they scale, you need to have the guardrails, and you need to have the visibility and predictability of what's going to happen. And it all starts, the most efficient way to do it is to shift it left as much as you can.
Yeah.
And which means the pull request. So you change your Terraform code, for example, in your pull request without env0. Also worth mentioning a great open source named Atlantis that does specifically that as well. Great first step. If you're thinking about automating your infrastructure as code, take a look at Atlantis.
We hear that a lot.
It's highly recommended as a first great step. So what Atlantis at env0 do with the pull request, we take a look at the code changes, and we perform the dry runs on all of the potential affected workspaces. That can be production, staging, and maybe five others. So that can help you as a customer, as a reviewer of the pull request of the branch, to make a smart decision whether or not you want to approve this change. env0 can add several other things that are important here, like cost estimation, right, and in general, some policies. Again, maybe you can prevent problematic deployments before they happen, and you can prevent it even before you merge those. So you can run some tests. Maybe you want to talk about it later, like policy as code, or static code analysis, or any other rules that you want to add. You can do it all the way in your pull request and prevent those problematic deployments before they are even merged.
And it's fantastic that you mentioned that. And at this point in time, it's going to seem that it's staged, but we didn't practice this conversation at all. But that feeds perfectly into the very last section, which is extensibility and integrations, and essentially just shifting stuff left into the deployment. We know that deploying that piece of infrastructure is not the only thing that you're going to do. You're going to make sure that you're keeping track of your budget, and you're kind of staying on top of how much that infrastructure is costing you. You want to make sure that you keep the guardrails and things on, utilizing policy. You're going to make sure that you check your code and make sure that your code is clean, that you're not deploying resources that are insecure or that don't meet your specific standards. And that's really a place that we shine. And that's the ability to pretty much run whatever you want, wherever you want in the step of the deployment. And with our custom flows, which, I mean, I've been working here for, over a year and a half now, and I've always said from the beginning, that's our secret sauce. And with that gives us the ability to do things like InfraCost if we want to do it a little even deeper than it is, integrated in. If we want to utilize Open Policy Agent, which we're going to get pretty deep into in the extensibility episode of this. utilizing things like Chekhov or TFSec or anything like that. I always like hearing why y'all chose to decide to go the route of utilizing custom flows and designing it the way that we did versus having things that were just hard built and integrated into the platform.
I think I've never shared this information besides Omri, the co-founder. So in the very early days of env0, I met a great friend of mine. His name is Arel. He's now the chief architect at Coralogics, and he knows his stuff. And I basically presented him the approach of env0, and I wanted to get his feedback. And the first thing he said is about the extensibility. He said, you're building the right stuff, but the most important thing to build is to allow your users to build their own stuff that will be integrated into your solution. And that's when we thought about the custom flows that can be used in so many different use cases. And that's the beauty. We always surprised by the creativity of our customers and how they implement that. That's the natural place to integrate policies, like you've mentioned. Open policy agent is what I believe the de facto standard today for policy as code. They're doing an amazing job at Styra over there. Cost estimation with infra cost and other tools for cost estimation. The static code analysis like Chekhov, TFSec, TerraScan, and so many other static code analysis that prevent you from provisioning virtual machines with an empty password and an SSH port open and crazy things that happen, or weak password. So that's one thing to prevent problematic deployments. Another thing is just we've mentioned infrastructure as code so many times here, but infrastructure as code works best together with configuration management.
Exactly right.
After you provision resources, it probably makes sense to configure those. Tools like Chef, Puppet, and Ansible are very useful, less for provisioning resources, more for configuring your applications. So combining those two together and obviously integrating to your existing platforms that you're already using. It can be your CMDB or Jira or other web services or APIs that you want to make smart decisions on the fly dynamically. So all of those things can be achieved with whatever you want. It can be AWS, GCP, G-Cloud CLI, and the Azure CLI. It can be used with the basic Python, Bash. Sometimes we see PowerShell. By the way, yesterday I had a conversation and somebody mentioned COBOL. I like grabbed my head and why are you talking about COBOL? But if
what year is it again?
It was crazy. So the reason I'm saying that it doesn't matter. If you have the technology that you need in order to properly put those Lego pieces together, our custom flows, basically it's another YAML. We all love YAMLs. env0 YAML, if you add that to your Git repo, basically allows you to extend those workflows endlessly, and you can do crazy things with it.
That's fantastic. And you're absolutely right. Like there's no point in deploying infrastructure if you're not going to do something with it. So having the ability inside of the tool to not just go through and make sure that your infrastructure deployments are correct, they're within, policy, they check and everything's good, but then take that a step further and actually do something with it, with your configuration management, or even shout out to our latest feature. We now have native Kubernetes deployments. So we can actually utilize infrastructure as code to deploy that cluster. And then we can trigger off a deployment of the actual applications inside of that or whatever services that you need there. So we're really helping to try to bring everything end to end from infrastructure to configuration, giving you the ability to be as easy as you want us to be or as complex as you need us to be. It looks like we've kind of gone through everything here. I want to make sure that we, kind of keep these short and sweet and to the point. Ohad, I really appreciate you coming on and, talking as always. It's always good talking to you and, going back and forth on stuff. So everybody stay tuned, keep an eye out for the next episodes. If you have any questions or anything at any time, feel free to check us out at env0, env, and the number 0.com. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at env0. And we're always here for you for questions, problems, or, just talking about infrastructure as code in general. Ohad, do you have anything closing that you would like to say?
We love developers, and we love infrastructure and DevOps, CloudOps engineers. So that's yet another reason why our product is always available for everybody to use. Go to the website, click free trial. We have a free tier, we have free trial. Don't need to talk to sales, just try the product. Our documentation is available as well. We have the chat if you need some help, and just use it and see how and if it suits your use case.
I know once people get started with us and they realize how easy it is to get from zero to deployed, they're usually pretty sold. So thanks again for joining me, and everybody be on the lookout for the next episodes. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Tim.